Oh, look at that dress. It'll be perfect for a night out, Catherine's best friend, Quinn, said. Catherine followed Quinn's gaze to a strapless, black tube dress that looked way too short to be considered moderate for a 23-year-old woman. She scoffed, "That's for women who like to party." Quinn frowned at her. "Have you ever been to a party before?" "Of course I have. Not one of those black tie events where snobby, rich people try to one-up each other while sipping champagne. I mean a real party, dancing, loud music, real drinks, sweaty bodies, hot men that party." Catherine made a gagging noise, then realized it was unladylike. She shook her head. "No, Quinn. Why in heaven's name would I want to go to one of those?" Quinn shook her head with a sad smile. "You're my best friend, but you have no life." "What do you mean?" "I'm here shopping with you." Quinn scoffed. "This hardly counts. In fact, my brother told me about his club on the outskirts of the city. He said it was the best club he's been to. We should go check it out." No, Catherine would not be caught dead in a club. It would ruin her family's image that had been cultivated over generations. Quinn rolled her eyes. "See, you have no fun." Catherine's other best friend, Tara, rejoined them after she made a stop at the restrooms. "Who has no fun?" "Kath," Quinn said. Tara smirked. "True. Hey. I do have fun." "Have you been to a club before?" Tara asked innocently. Catherine grumbled. She did have fun, damn it. Quinn and Tara thought otherwise. "What could be so fun about a club anyways?" she asked. Was she really missing out? Quinn grinned. "Tara and I will pick you up and take you to that club I was telling you about." Catherine opened her mouth to object, but peer pressure is an evil thing. "Fine," she muttered. Quinn and Tara's faces lit up. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. That evening, she couldn't decide what to wear. She was 22, yet her closet mostly consisted of pantsuits, as she worked for her father's cooperation, and evening gowns, for all the black tie events where snobby, rich people try to one-up each other while sipping champagne. She didn't own even a pair of jeans. Maybe Quinn and Tara were right, she didn't have any real fun. She called Quinn. "Hello. I don't have anything to wear." Quinn snickered. "Okay, I'll pick you up in 20 minutes and we'll find something in my closet." "Thanks," she said. She hung up and found a black purse that should match with whatever Quinn found for her to wear. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Catherine grabbed her purse and headed downstairs where the butler had already let Quinn inside. They headed back out and to Quinn's flat. It was a nice apartment that was very modern. Quinn led her to the closet. Half an hour later, Catherine found herself in the skimpiest dress she'd ever seen. It was worse than the black one she'd seen earlier. That one at least had a back, this one's back was cut so low an inch lower and her butt would be out. "Quinn. I can't wear this." "You can and you will. You look great. Now let's go pick up Tara." "But, no buts. Tonight you are going to have fun." Catherine grumbled, starting to regret her decision to go with them in the first place. They arrived at the club around 9 p.m. Things were just getting into full swing. The music was loud but not too loud. The neon lights added a disco vibe that, admittedly, Catherine liked. "Let's kick this Memorial night off with shots." Tara, the drink lover in the group, said. She dragged Catherine to the bar and Quinn followed. They claimed 3 stools and Tara waved the bartender over. He motioned that he'd be there in a minute. While she waited, Catherine looked around. It was pretty packed, but there was breathing room. "You see any hot men I can snag for the night?" Quinn asked. Catherine giggled. Quinn was the one who liked to sleep around. The bartender worked his way over. "What can I get for you ladies?" he asked. Catherine shivered. His voice was like caramel running over her body, heating her to her core. She looked up and found he was looking directly at her. He was muscular under that black t-shirt, she could tell. He was tall too. He had caramel-colored hair and eyes. She'd never felt more feminine in her life. And she wasn't complaining. Quinn nudged her, "Got a little drool on your chin." That snapped her out of her haze. The bartender smirked and looked at Tara. She ordered their shots and he went off to make them. "He's hot," Tara said. Catherine found herself nodding. Quinn shook her head. "You don't think he's hot?" Catherine hissed. "Oh, I do. It's just a rule of thumb never to get involved with the bartenders because what happens when you come back to the club? It'll be awkward. One-night stands are a one-time thing and you're not supposed to see the guy afterwards." "Oh," Catherine deflated. Had she been thinking about a one-night stand with the sexy bartender? No. Who was she kidding? Of course she had. Then the thought hit her, she was never coming back to this club again. She smirked as he brought their shots back over. "When do you get off?" she asked him. His eyebrow quirked, then he looked at the clock. "Normally when this place closes at 3 in the morning, but I could ask my brother to take over if it's urgent." She nodded. "I'll be here for about an hour." He grinned. 10 it is." He walked away without further comment. Quinn and Tara were gaping. Proud of herself, she tossed back her shot, stood, and headed to the dance floor. Jackson watched the woman he'd just agreed to have sex with head to the dance floor. He smirked. He liked her confidence. Most women just pushed their tits at him and expected him to ask them to hook up so they could go running back to their friends and say he asked me out. But not her. She asked him straight up, and he liked it. His brother, Jacob, came from the back. "Hey, could you cover for me for about an hour?" he asked. Jacob nodded. "Sure. What time?" 10. "Okay." He stole one last glance at the woman before getting back to work. At 10, he found her relaxing on one of the comfortable couches. She smiled when he came into view. "Let's go," he said, holding out his hand. She placed her hand in his and he hauled her to her feet. They headed out of the club into the cool night air. It was October, so it wasn't hot or cold, just perfect. He led her to his car and they climbed in. He took her to the nearby hotel where he took every hookup. It was convenient. It was a fairly simple hour after that. They'd fucked for the majority of the time. He could tell she didn't do this often, she was too inexperienced and didn't know what she wanted. After her 10th orgasm, or something like that, he'd stopped counting at 5, they were both exhausted, and fell into a restful sleep. He awoke around 11:30 and remembered his brother was covering for him. He slid out of bed and took in her form. She was beautiful. He quickly and quietly dressed, then left and headed back to work. Tonight's fuck, complete. 2 months later. Catherine parked her car in the parking lot and headed inside the mall. It was nearly Christmas and she wanted to get some last-minute shopping in. She loved Christmas shopping nearly as much as she loved the holiday itself when she got to spend time with her family. They had big Christmas parties every year, inviting all their known family and friends. She headed into Louis Vuitton and picked out a scarf for her mother. Her mother loved scarves, and this was one she didn't have yet. After purchasing the scarf, she headed on to the next store. After around an hour of shopping, she took her accumulated bags to her car. She saw the food court across the parking lot and decided to grab a bite. On her way across, she heard tires screech. She looked to her left and saw a car barreling towards her. Next thing she knew, everything went black. Patricia Belford and her husband Samuel had been putting some presents underneath the tree when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. "Hello. Mrs. Belford. This is she. Your daughter, Catherine Belford, was hit by a car and is being rushed to the hospital." Patricia grabbed Samuel's arm for support. "What do you mean?" How did this happen? She put it on speakerphone so Samuel could hear. The man explained what happened and told her what hospital Catherine was being taken to. On their way out of the house, Samuel called up his lawyer. He was going to sue this man who had the nerve to hit his daughter. When they reached the hospital, they were told which floor she was on. She was in the ICU and had gone into emergency surgery. While waiting, Samuel talked to their lawyer. About 2 hours later, the doctor came into the waiting room. How is she? If she needs better medical care, we will pay for it, Patricia said. She survived the surgery. So did the baby. We're still in the unknown zone, so we'll have to wait and see if she pulls through. Patricia didn't hear back baby. She looked at Samuel and he looked angry. What do you mean the baby? He asked. She's pregnant. With whom? She's not married. We can't tell you who the father is just by knowing she's pregnant. Samuel got back on his phone. Patricia looked at the doctor. Can I see her? You can look through the glass, but we want to make sure the room stays sterile. She nodded and followed him to the room. There Catherine lay, bruises covering the few unwrapped places on her body. She was hooked up to so many machines. Patricia dabbed the tears in her eyes away. So much for a Merry Christmas season. Meanwhile, Samuel called one of the private investigators on his speed dial and told him to look into who Catherine had associated with lately. He was going to find out who had the nerve to sleep with his daughter out of wedlock. The following morning, he got a call back from his PI. You better have good news, he said. I found him. You did? Who is he? His name is Jackson Forrester. He's 23 and works at a club not too far from here. From what I found, about 2 months ago he and Miss Belford had a one-night stand at a nearby hotel. Do you have his contact information? I do. Email it to me. Will do. Samuel hung up. He headed back to the hospital with Patricia. When they arrived, the doctor looked grim. What happened? Patricia demanded. Miss Belford has gone into a coma. Samuel could feel the blood drain from his face. 8 months later. Knock knock. Jackson rolled over and looked at his phone. It was 10 in the morning. Everybody who knew him knew not to come knocking at 10 a.m., he was trying to get his sleep. He worked until the club closed at 3 and then helped clean up. He'd gotten home at 4. He grumbled, this better be important. He pulled on a t-shirt and some shorts, then headed to the door. He swung it open, expecting to see Jacob or one of his friends. But instead there stood an older man in a suit who looked a little pissed at being made to wait for 1 minute. Jackson felt underdressed. Yes, he asked in a clipped tone, to show the man that he wasn't the only one who was irritated. This seemed to irritate the man further. Are you Jackson Forrester? Yes. Who's asking? I'm Richard Smith, personal lawyer to the Belford family. Belford? Weren't they some ultra-rich family? What did they want with him? Okay. Do you remember her? He held up a picture of a woman. He instantly remembered her. It was the assertive chick who he'd slept with almost a year ago. He'd hoped she would come back for repeats, but she never did. He nodded. Yeah, I've met her once. He nodded. This is Catherine Belford. Well shit. Were they going to sue him or something? They did send their lawyer. And now he really felt underdressed. Do you remember sharing a bed with her? They were going to sue him. He gulped. Yes, the night we met. When was that? Last October. He nodded. She got pregnant. His heart stuttered. What? Is that why they were here? To get him to sign over complete custody because he wasn't rich enough to be the father? He clenched his fists. If you think Miss Belford has found herself in an unfortunate situation and is signing over complete custody of your 1-month-old daughter. Please sign here. Jackson blinked. Did he hear correctly? Are you telling me that she wanted to give me the baby? Yes. Exactly. Also, because of the circumstances and the Belford wealth, they have given the naming privilege to you. You must put her name here so I can have it submitted to the courts as well. Jackson was in shock. He signed his name, then moved up to put his daughter's name. The name that jumped out at him was Belle, because this guy kept saying Belford, so he put Belle Forrester down. The man nodded and walked to his car. Out of the back seat he extracted this high-tech looking car seat with a sleeping form in it. He brought it to Jackson and handed it to him. Congratulations, Mr. Forrester, and good luck. All her papers will be mailed to you. You will get them within the week by UPS. You'll receive an email when they arrive and you'll have to sign for them. With that, he turned, walked away, got into his car, and backed out. Jackson looked down at the sleeping baby. She had her mother's blonde hair. I wonder if she has my eyes, he mused. He took her inside and closed the door. That's when it all came crashing down. He was a father. He had a daughter. He didn't know the first thing about raising a child. He didn't have any supplies either. Shit. He called Jacob. Hello? I'm surprised you're awake. I have an emergency. What is it? The chick you took home is already clingy. What? And Bell chose that moment to wake up and let out an ear-piercing scream. He cursed under his breath. Was that a baby? Jacob asked. Yes, dipshit, that was a baby. Correction, that was my baby. And I need help. On my way. 1 year, 4 months later. Jackson pulled up at his dad's house. Even though he was tired after a night of work, he couldn't help but smile at the prospect of seeing his daughter again. She'd been shoved at him some 16 months ago, and at the time he had no clue how to raise her. But he'd quickly gotten the hang of it. Now, his house was baby-proof and he'd consider himself a great dad. He got out and went up the front steps, lightly knocking on the door. He left Belle with his dad when he worked, which wasn't bad because he worked at night. When he got off of work, he came and picked her up. His dad opened the door and motioned for him to come in. Jackson came in and found Belle asleep in the guest bedroom. He gently picked her up, thanked his dad, then took her out. He buckled her in and drove home. When he arrived, he carried her to her room and tucked her in. He kissed her forehead, then headed to bed. He loved his daughter more than anything and thanked the Belfords, in his head, every day that they'd tracked him down and given him her instead of sending her into the foster care system. He stripped down and climbed into his bed. A lot had changed since Belle had come into his life. He didn't do one-night stands anymore, for starters. He had one relationship for 2 months, but she didn't like Belle, or rather, she wasn't cut out to be a mother. He turned his light out and fell into an exhausted sleep. The next morning, Samuel and Patricia got called to the hospital early in the morning. What is it? Is Catherine okay? Patricia asked. Catherine had been in a coma for 2 years, and the doctors were starting to think she may never come out. But with the money they had, Patricia and her husband were never going to give up until they had to. The doctor who'd been monitoring Catherine since the beginning smiled. She'd woken up. Patricia felt tears prick her eyes and she quickly went to Catherine's room. Catherine's eyes were heavy and her mind felt blank. Where was she? She pried her eyes open to find her mother and father standing over her. Her mother had tears running down her cheeks. Her father's eyes were glazed. Why were they crying? They never cried. She tried to open her mouth and ask, but it felt heavy too. Catherine dear, can you hear me? Her mother asked. With great effort, she smiled. It wasn't like she could say yes. Relief flooded her mother's eyes. You're in the hospital. The hospital? She became alarmed. You were hit by a car and then went into a coma. Her eyes widened. Wait, forgotten. You were in a coma for 2 years. She gaped. Her mother smiled sadly, but you've come back to us and that's all we can ask for. Patricia and Samuel stayed and talked to Catherine for an hour, but she grew weary and fell asleep after that. The doctor told them he'd give them a call if she slipped back into a coma. On the way back, they had a lot to discuss. We won't tell her about the child. It's best that way. We can't have a bastard in our family, and there's no way she's going to marry that bartender man, Samuel said with conviction. Patricia nodded. To ensure that, we should move her to our country home. It'll be good for her recovery as well. Good idea, my dear. Patricia smiled, but in the back of her mind she couldn't help but feel like they were making a grave mistake. That evening, Jackson headed to his dad's house. He unbuckled Belle. She raised her arms and he picked her up and carried her inside. She could walk, but she preferred being carried. He remembered the first time she'd walked to him. It was one of the happiest days of his life. Jacob opened the door and grinned, reaching for his niece. "How's my princess?" She giggled. Jacob managed to charm all the girls. Jackson rolled his eyes and handed her over. "I'm going to head off to work." Jacob nodded. "Okay, I'll be in a little later." Jacob worked during the day but hung out at the club at night. Jackson gave Belle a kiss on her forehead, then headed to work. When he arrived, the bar was running smoothly. He headed behind the counter and placed a hand on Victor's shoulder. "Good work, Vic. I can take over now." Victor nodded. "Okay, man. See you later." Jackson nodded and got to work. He really enjoyed working at the club. He got to meet people and they all shared something in common, a like to drink. He walked over to a group of women who were giggling amongst themselves. "How can I help you, ladies?" he asked. They all smiled with obvious interest. "We'll have shots," one of them said. Another smiled. "What time do you get off, handsome?" His mind went back to that night years ago, when Catherine had been so daring. He almost smiled, until he remembered the fact that she dumped her child on him. No, she'd sent her lawyer to do it. She couldn't even be woman, enough to do it herself. And he loved Belle, but he knew that when she got older, she'd want a woman to relate to. There were things that he wouldn't be able to help her with. Boys weren't one of those. And that sent his mood down to hell. He hadn't realized he was glaring until the woman said, "I didn't know you were taken." He reined his glare in and sighed, "I'm sorry. I'm not. I'm just not in a good mood. I'll get your shots right away." He pushed thoughts of Catherine fucking Belford out of his head and concentrated on his work that he loved. And as he chatted with people, he found himself lightening up and his mood improving. This was why he worked at a club. People were so free to be themselves here. He slid a man his drink and went on to the next order. By the end of his shift and closing time, he wasn't mad anymore. He figured Catherine was too busy with high society to bother with a child. It was probably for the best that she gave up all rights instead of trying that co-parenting bullshit when she wasn't available. He picked Belle up around 4:30 the following morning and took her home. 2 years later. "I can't wait to see you either," she said to Quinn over the phone. After saying their goodbyes she hung up. She was excited to visit Quinn and Tara for the holidays. She hadn't seen much of them in the past 2 years. Her parents thought it would be a good idea for her to spend some time in their country house with fresh air. After about 6 months, she'd started working again, but this time from home. After 6 more months, she took up a job at the sub-office in the nearby city. She loved her stay here, but she was ready to get back to the city and the life she was used to. It was almost Christmas time and she shuddered at the memory of what had happened 4 years ago. Shaking the thought off, she checked to make sure her suitcases were packed and ready to go, then she told her driver she was ready to go to the airport. After a couple of hours flight, she landed in Lex. Her parents already had a driver waiting for her, and he took her to her parents' mansion. "Catherine, dear. How have you been?" her mother asked. Catherine smiled, "Good, Mom. How are you?" "I'm doing well. Come, your father is waiting." Catherine spent the next hour chatting with her parents, then retired to her room to sleep. The next morning, she got ready to hang out with Quinn and Tara. From what she'd heard, Tara had a family now. She was excited to meet them. But today was girlfriend day. "Catherine, your guests are here," the butler told her. "Thank you," she said before hurrying down the stairs. She threw her arms around Quinn and Tara, drawing them into a group hug. The three of them took the next 10 minutes to exchange "I missed you" and "How have you been," then they scuffled out of the door and into the car she'd had waiting. "So what are we going to do today?" Quinn asked, practically bouncing in her seat. "I want to end the day with some drinks," Tara said. Still the drinker, even with young children. "But no picking up guys for you," Catherine said. Tara chuckled, "Yeah. I don't think Wes would like that." Wes was her husband. Catherine refused to let the sorrow show that she'd missed the wedding. "Let's do some last-minute Christmas shopping," Quinn suggested. "I like that. Then we can get something to eat." "I'm on board." With somewhat of a plan in mind, they headed off. Their first stop was the mall where they did some last-minute shopping. They stopped for lunch in the food court a couple of hours later. "Okay, so what do you guys want to do now?" Catherine asked before taking a bite of her cheese dog, corn dog filled with cheese instead of meat. "Well," Tara said with a grin, "the elementary in the neighborhood I live in is doing a Christmas play in half an hour. My little Toby is playing Jesus." She was oozing happiness. Quinn looked at Catherine. "I'm fine with that. I could use a minute off my feet." Catherine nodded. "After we eat, let's go." After they ate, they headed to the school per Tara's instructions and only arrived 5 minutes late. "You're late," a man whispered to Tara. She turned to Catherine. "Kath, this is my husband Wes." "Wes, this is one of my besties, Catherine." Catherine shook his hand. "Nice to meet you." "Likewise. Tara's been talking about your visit non-stop." Catherine chuckled. "I should hope so. We haven't seen each other in a long time." Wes turned to the stage and pointed to the baby in the car seat that had been artfully decorated to look like a manger. "That's our son, Toby. He's so cute." Catherine said, a twinge of envy piercing her heart. She wasn't a husband and children like Tara. After the play, Catherine, Quinn, and Tara talked for a while and caught up, and Catherine got to meet Tara's family. Toby was the cutest baby she'd ever seen. He was the only baby she'd seen up close and personal. She wanted a little Toby like him. After catching up, they went to their respective houses, changed, then met up and headed to the club. "Is this that one club I went to before?" she asked as they stepped out of the car. "It is," Quinn said. "Does the same bartender work here?" Quinn smirked. "Looking for round two, are you?" Catherine nodded. "He was a decent lay." "You might be out of luck," Tara said. "Why's that?" "I been a few times over the last year and he's never taken any woman anywhere. Maybe he waits until closing time." Tara shrugged. "The way he jumped at a chance to be with you mid-work, it seemed like he did that often. Or he's waiting for my return." They laughed and went inside. It was just like she remembered it. Her eyes went straight to the bar, and there he was. He chose that moment to look up and their eyes met. She expected him not to remember her, but from the look his face took on, he did, and he wasn't happy she was here. She has her nerve coming here, Jackson thought. She ditched her child so she could bar hop. He knew he was glaring and she deserved it. What kind of mother hands their child away and out of their life? She and her friends, the two she'd come with before, came to the bar. He wished he could toss them out, but he didn't own the club. One of her friends raised her eyebrow at him and he glared at her too. She motioned for time to come over. He wished he was serving someone so he could put it off, but he couldn't. He hadn't really thought about what he'd feel when he saw her again, but neither had he expected this anger. Maybe he was being irrational and she had a good reason for handing off their daughter. Or maybe she was a partier. But what took him back was the confusion on her face when he walked over. "What do you want?" he asked in a clipped tone. "Haven't got laid in a while," one of her friends asked. He knew it was a joke, yet it only served to anger him more, because no, he hadn't gotten laid in a long time. He clenched his fists. A hand settled on his shoulder. "I'll handle this," Jacob said. He nodded and walked away. Catherine was so confused. What put him in such a bad mood? Or was it her? What had she done? From their time together 5 years ago, he'd been the one who left without a backwards glance, not her. Did he not want to see her again? She expected maybe awkwardness, but not full-blown anger. The man who replaced him looked similar, so she assumed they were brothers. And he didn't look too happy to see her either. Exasperated, she threw her hands into the air. "What did I do? Why are you both so mad at me?" He slightly rolled his eyes like it was obvious. "What do you want?" "Maybe we'll take our business elsewhere if you two are going to be assholes," Tara said. He looked at her. "Then take it elsewhere." Catherine was taken back. She should sue them. But what good does that get her? They'd only hate her even more. She sighed. "We'll have shots, first." Tara looked at her. "What? We're leaving." Catherine shrugged and fiddled with her napkin. She felt tears prick the back of her eyes. She didn't know why they hated her, but whatever she'd done, she knew she probably deserved it. And that made her feel bad, because all they'd been was nice to her. And one had given her the best night of her life. "Excuse me," she said, sliding off the stool. She went to the restroom to get herself together. From the back, Jackson watched Catherine dash to the restrooms. He could see her glossed eyes and knew she was about to cry. Damn it, what had Jacob said to her? As much as he couldn't stand her, he couldn't stand crying her more. He turned to Jacob and glared at his back. He wasn't supposed to make them cry. Her two friends were chiding and glaring at him. One got up and went after her. He sighed. This was getting out of hand. He went back to the front and went over to Jacob and the last remaining friend. "Been through enough? We were just having a girls' day." "We don't need your crap," she said. He ran his hands through his hair. "I think it's best if the three of you leave." She glared at him. "No shit, Sherlock. You've been treating us like crap since we walked in. I should sue both your asses." Jackson shook his head. "I just wasn't expecting to see her today. I apologize for my behavior." He couldn't have her, let alone Catherine, suing this club. His dad would have his ass. She sighed. "What do you have against Catherine? She'd never hurt anyone intentionally." Jackson shook his head. "I don't think she did it to hurt me." She gave him a puzzled look, but Catherine and her other friend returned. Her other friend glared at him. Catherine's eyes were red and puffy. Damn it. She wouldn't look at him either. "Let's go, Tara, we're taking our money elsewhere." "And I'm never coming back," the friend who'd gone after Catherine said. Tara looked at him, then nodded. The three of them left the club. Jacob sighed. "Why the hell did you make her cry?" Jackson hissed. "I didn't. She just started crying." "You know how women are," Jacob said. "That's sexist," a lady sitting at the bar said. She seemed to have overheard everything. Jacob sighed again. "I have no idea why she'd even think to come here." Jackson shrugged. "How would I know?" After they left the club, Catherine wasn't in the mood to party, so she had Quinn and Tara drop her off at home. She made it to her room unnoticed, then locked the door and flopped on her bed. The waterworks opened and she couldn't stop the tears. She didn't know why she was so upset about him, but she was. She didn't even know what she'd done. She ended up crying herself to sleep that night. The next day, December 17th. Nothing gets Catherine's mind off of her emotions like working does, especially paperwork. She knew she'd supposed to be on vacation, but after last night, she needed to do a little bit of work today. She headed into her dad's office and settled in his big, leather chair. "It smells like him." She smiled. She sat her paperwork on the desk, realizing she doesn't have a pen. She knew her dad kept pens in one of his drawers, so she opened the top one. There are staplers, post-its, and stamps, but no pens. Closing it, she moves down to the second drawer and opened it. On the top is a manila folder with the name Belle Forrester on it. "Who's Belle Forrester?" she asked out loud. Her parents never had anything to hide from her, always making it clear what they wanted and when, so this should be no different. She opened the folder and some papers slid out. The one that caught her eye was a birth certificate. It belonged to this Belle Forrester and she was almost 3.5 years old. She looked at the parents' column and her world began to crumble. This couldn't be. In the mother column was her own name and in the father's column was Jackson Forrester. With trembling hands she looked through the rest of the paper and confirmed her suspicions. Jackson Forrester was the man at the bar. According to her calculations, the baby was born when she was in a coma. Had she gotten pregnant from that one night stand and her parents aborted the baby? No, the baby was alive. But where was she? Catherine was a mother. But where was her daughter? Then it dawned on her, Jackson had her. And then the light bulb went off and she broke down. Jackson hated her because he thought he dumped their child on him and left. She swiped angrily at her tears. She stuffed the papers back into the folder and put it back, then gathered her own and left the office. Her parents had snatched her child away while she'd been in the hospital. It was too clear to deny. Not ready to confront them about it, she locked herself in her room, and didn't come out until the evening, when she headed to the club. She had to speak to Jackson right away. He had to know she'd never ditch her own flesh and blood. God, what must he think of her? She practically ran into the club, looking eagerly for Jackson. He was behind the counter with his brother again. "Jackson," she said, as soon as she walked up. He looked up and gave her a questioning look. At least it wasn't anger. Jacob, on the other hand, didn't look so pleased. She swallowed the sudden lump of emotion in her throat and said, "Belle. I didn't know." His eyes widened when she said Belle. That was all the confirmation she needed. She broke down. Before she hit the ground, she felt arms wrap around her and haul her up and against a hard chest. She knew it was Jackson without even looking. She'd been in his arms before and she'd never forget what it was like. She knew his scent too. He practically carried her to a seat and sat her down, then knelt in front of her. Jackson didn't know what was happening. Last night she acted like all was right in her world. Now, she was a sobbing mess, and she'd said Belle. He motioned for someone to bring him water. Jacob brought him a bottle of water, which he opened and handed to her. She gulped it down, then looked at him. "Better?" he asked. She nodded. "Good. Now what about Belle?" This seemed to bring on another wave of emotion, but she held it back. I just found out about her this morning." He almost scoffed. How could a woman not know she was pregnant? His disbelief must have shown on his face because she continued, 4 years ago, about this time, I got hit by a car. I went into a coma for 2 years. During that time, my parents must have given her to you. They never told me." Jackson looked at Jacob. Was that possible? He looked thoughtful, then said, "I do remember hearing in the news that some rich girl got hit in a parking lot while Christmas shopping. That was about 4 years ago. Jackson looked back at Catherine and could see the sincerity in her eyes. She had had no idea about their child. She hadn't given her up. Her parents had. No wonder she'd been so clueless last night, she hadn't even known. And that just made him feel bad for the way he treated her. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" she asked. "The way I treated you last night. You thought I was the type of woman who'd drop their kid off with anyone so they could go party." He nodded. She looked away. "I'm sorry. Over 3 years ago, your family's lawyer came to my house and told me you didn't want her anymore." Her eyes widened and darkened with anger, clearly at her parents. Then she looked nervous and he knew what she was going to ask before she even said it. "Can I meet her?" Catherine held her breath and waited for his answer. She knew that if he said no, she'd probably break down on the spot again. But it was his right. She really didn't have any claim over their daughter. He slowly nodded, "Sure." Her face lit up and she hugged him without second thought. He hugged her back, then set her back into the chair. "Can I meet her today?" Her excitement was getting the best of her. He shook his head. "Tomorrow. Give me your phone number so I can text you my address and the time." She eagerly told him her number and he put it into his phone. He nodded, "Okay, I'll text you." She nodded and he stood up. "I'll see you tomorrow then." He and his brother returned to work. She left the club a bundle of nerves. She had a daughter. That brought her thoughts back to her parents. Why had they done that to her? She had so many questions. But now wasn't the time to ask them. Perhaps she went to his house and found she didn't feel any motherly pull to Belle? Or found that she wasn't cut out to be a mother. Then bringing this up to her parents wouldn't be necessary. She nodded and headed back home, deciding to ask her parents about it later. Besides, she didn't want them interfering. If they sent Belle away once already, who's to say they wouldn't again before she had the chance to meet her? She got into her car and drove back home. She was excited and nervous about tomorrow. When she got home, she called Tara and Quinn on Skype. Tara was feeding Toby and Quinn was munching on chips. "What's up?" Tara asked, like having her boob hanging out on Skype was an everyday occurrence. Catherine took a deep breath. "I have a daughter." Silence. "You got a dog?" "OMG. What kind?" Quinn asked. Tara was looking at her quizzically. She shook her head, like, "I gave birth to a baby." Quinn's mouth worked for a moment but nothing came out. "And you're just not telling us?" "Got jealous of Toby," Tara said as a joke. Catherine looked at her intertwined hands. "I just found out this morning. When I was in a coma, she was born and my parents gave her to her dad." "How'd you find out?" Tara asked. "I was looking for a pen in my dad's desk." "Who's her dad?" "Jackson, from the club." Gasps. The next day, December 18th. Catherine couldn't decide on what to wear. Should she go with casual jeans, now she owned a pair or two, or should she go with a dress? She had this maxi dress that she'd been wanting to wear too. But would he think she was dressing up to impress? Was she trying to impress him? Her mother stuck her head in. "Going out?" Catherine bit back a retort. "Yes." "Let me guess, you can't decide what to wear." Catherine shook her head. Her mother stepped in. "Where are you going?" "Maybe I can help." "Going to visit Tara and her son Toby." The lie rolled off her tongue too easily. Her mother nodded. "I'd say pants then so you could get down and play with him." Catherine nodded. "Thanks Mom. That's what moms are for." Her mom walked out. Catherine grabbed the dress and headed to the bathroom to change. She pulled up at Jackson's house around 11 that morning. She was nervous. Her hands were trembling. Slowly, she got out of the car and headed to his front door. She knocked and waited. He opened the door and smiled, "Catherine, come in." She came in and her eyes landed on the little girl in the living room with all pink on. Her hair was blonde like her own and in two braids. When she looked at her, Catherine saw she had Jackson's caramel-colored eyes. "Belle, this is Catherine." "Catherine, Belle." Catherine knelt down in front of Belle. "Hi." The girl smiled brightly, "Hi. Do you like to paint your nails?" Catherine smiled, "I do." "Daddy, can you get the nail polish, please?" she asked. Jackson nodded, "Sure, sweet pea." He went upstairs then came back with a little basket with an assortment of nail polish in it. Belle pulled out a neon pink color, "This one is my favorite." "Pink is my favorite color." "What's your favorite color?" Catherine felt herself relaxing, "Blue." Belle cringed but fished out all the blue nail polishes and handed them to her. Jackson settled onto the couch and watched them as they painted their nails. Thank goodness Catherine hadn't had her painted already. Surprisingly, Belle was pretty good at it, she only missed her nail a few times. She held up her hands to Jackson, "Look, Daddy." He examined her hands, "That's wonderful. You could be a professional one day." Her smile brightened at her father's praise, then she turned to Catherine, "Do you like them?" Catherine nodded, "I do." Belle examined her nails, "I like yours too." "Daddy, do you like?" Catherine. "Do you like Catherine's daddy?" Catherine held her hands out for Jackson to look at. He nodded, "Yeah, but yours are better." Belle grinned, "True." Catherine chuckled. "So what do you guys want to do while you wait for your fingers to dry?" Jackson asked. "Princess and the Frog," Belle announced without hesitation. Jackson looked at Catherine, "That's her favorite movie. We've seen it at least twice a month." Catherine smiled, "How cute. I haven't seen it in ages." Belle grinned, "Put it on, Daddy." "Yes, ma'am." After Princess and the Frog, they ate lunch, then they worked on a princess puzzle. Jackson joined them on this one. After working on the puzzle for a couple of hours, Belle wanted to color, which she and Catherine did. Then Jackson ordered pizza for dinner. At 7, Catherine was preparing to leave. "You'll come back tomorrow?" Belle asked. Catherine looked at Jackson and he shrugged. She smiled at Belle, "Same time, same place." And that was exactly what happened. Over the next week, Catherine spent every day with Jackson and Belle. Out the window flew her theory that she may not feel any motherly instincts toward Belle. Once, Belle had tripped and fell, scraping her knee. Before Jackson could reach her, Catherine scooped her up, wishing she could take away her pain. She'd put a band-aid on and kissed it better. In her free time, she'd done some shopping for Belle and a little for Jackson as well. December 24th. "I wish I could stay a little longer, but I have to get home," Catherine told Belle. "But you stayed longer yesterday," Belle whined. Jackson picked her up, "Let her go. She'll be back." Catherine nodded. "Tomorrow?" "Well, she may have plans with her family," Jackson said, "and so do we. I bought you 2 gifts. Maybe I can drop them off." Belle smiled, "Yes." Catherine looked at Jackson. "Sure. I'll text you where we're going to be." She nodded, then headed home. Once home, she changed into a more evening dress and did her makeup and hair. Her parents told her they were having dinner and wanted her there. A dinner the day before Christmas was weird. She headed downstairs to be met by her mother. "Come, dear, he's waiting." "Who's waiting?" Catherine asked. "Alexander Jensen and his parents." The Jensens had always been close to the Belfords, and Catherine would consider them friends. She followed her mother into the living room. Alexander and his parents were sitting on the couch opposite where her dad was sitting. Her mother sat next to him and she sat next to her. She greeted the Jensens with a small smile. Catherine, we've been talking with the Jensens, and we think that it will benefit both of our families if you and Alexander were to marry, her father said. She wasn't surprised. Her parents had hinted at it before. You and Alexander are friends, I'm sure you'll grow to love him like I love your father, her mother said. Everyone was looking at her. Did they expect her to make a choice right now? Yes. Yes, they did. That's how business was. And that's what this marriage would be to them, a business deal. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding and plastered on a fake smile. Sure. It's not like she was looking for love. She didn't really believe in it. She'd seen many couples who loved each other separate over one thing or another. No, her parents hadn't, but they were never the warm, cozy type anyways. Better to go into a marriage knowing it was a business deal than thinking she loved Alexander. Her parents smiled. Good choice, dear. Come, everyone, let's have dinner. We'll announce the engagement at tomorrow's Christmas party, her mother said. No wonder they wanted her to agree to it today. As they headed to the dining hall, Alexander pulled her aside. Are you sure about this? He asked. She nodded with a shrug. Sure, why not? He let out a deep breath and got on one knee, pulling out a ring box. Then let's do this properly. Will you marry me, Catherine? She smiled. He wouldn't make such a bad husband. He didn't have to do this because it was a business deal, but he did anyway. Yes, I'll marry you. He slid the ring on and got up. Let's go eat, she said. The next day, Christmas. Catherine woke up Christmas morning feeling happy. She was excited to see Jackson and Belle and give them the gifts she'd gotten them. She slipped out of bed and headed into the bathroom where she showered and got ready for the day. She wore a cotton, red dress that hugged her nicely. She paired it with some heeled boots and a light face of makeup, complete with red lipstick. Knock knock. Come in. Alexander stuck his head in. Merry Christmas, Catherine. She smiled. Merry Christmas. What are you doing here so early? It's 10. People are already starting to arrive. Oops. I must have lost track of time getting ready. And you look stunning. She blushed. Thank you. So do you. Why thank you. She pulled the ring out of the drawer and slipped it on. I'm ready to go and mingle. He grinned and held out his arm. Then let's go. The announcement of their engagement was met with clapping. Everyone seemed genuinely happy for them, which led Catherine to wonder if all of them had business marriages and this was normal for them. Around 3, she slipped out and checked to make sure all of the gifts for Jackson and Belle were in her trunk. You're leaving? Alexander asked. She jumped then sighed. Yeah. No more than an hour. He motioned to her trunk. That's a lot of stuff. She smiled. You want to come with me? Sure. It'll probably be better that way. If anyone notices we're gone, they'll think we went to make out somewhere. She ignored that comment and got into her car. She didn't want to make out with Alexander. He got into the passenger seat and they left. So where are we headed? He asked. She sighed. I'm going to tell you something that you are not going to repeat to anyone. He raised an eyebrow. Are you secretly feeding the homeless or something? She rolled her eyes. No. I have a daughter. His eyes widened. What? Since when? Long story. Anyway, she lives with her dad. We're going there now to give them those gifts. How old is she? 3. He nodded, and he has full custody. She nodded. You could get back some. You'd be okay with that? Of course. She bobbed her head. Maybe she should. She'd have to talk to Jackson first. He'd been so welcoming this past week that she didn't want to seem ungrateful. They arrived at the address Jackson had sent her about 20 minutes later. There were a lot of cars parked in the front. Stay here while I go get him to help me. Okay. She went to the front door and knocked. A lady opened the door. Yes. Hi. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. I'm looking for Jackson. Jackson, the lady yelled. He came from the living room and smiled. Catherine's here, he said. Belle came darting from somewhere and threw herself into Catherine's arms. Catherine hugged her. I missed you too. Jackson watched the exchange between his daughter and Catherine. She seemed to be getting set into that mother role, which worried him just a little bit. Then he noticed the ring on her finger. Had that always been there? And why did the knowledge that she was engaged to someone else piss him off? He shook off the feeling as Catherine set Belle down. I got you and your dad gifts. Me? Jackson asked. She grinned. I did. Come on and help me get them from the trunk, Belle. Belle raced down the stairs with Catherine behind her. Jackson stepped into the doorway to watch. He saw a man standing beside Catherine's car. He looked at Jackson and gave a slight nod. Was that her fiancé? Belle came staggering up the driveway with a box. Jackson took it from her and sat it inside. Catherine came next with an armload of gifts. Geez woman, when did you have time to get all of this? He asked. She grinned. Oh, you know. Come and meet my, fiancé. She seemed so unsure about the word fiancé on her tongue. Jackson reined in his annoyance and walked over. Jackson, meet my, fiancé, Alexander. Alexander, meet my daughter's father, Jackson. Alexander shook hands with Jackson. The moment Catherine had said my daughter's father, Jackson, he knew he was facing an impossible challenge, winning her heart. In fact, he didn't even want to begin that challenge because he'd already given his heart to someone else. He could hear the smile in her voice when she said Jackson. He saw the way Jackson's eyes trailed after her when she went to get presents. These two buffoons liked each other. So why had she agreed to marry him? He liked her as a friend and wouldn't have been mad if she turned him down yesterday. It was very clear that this marriage was a business deal. His parents would have been insulted, but at the end of the day, they weren't the ones tying the knot. He looked between her and Jackson. Were they purposely not acting on these feelings? That would be stupid since they had a kid together. And why hadn't he known about this kid? Or was something else keeping them apart? He wanted answers, but he already knew neither of them had them. After dropping off all the gifts, Catherine watched Belle open a few before she and Alexander headed back to their own party. Jackson eyed the gifts she'd gotten him. What would be inside? Who was that? His cousin, Rachel, asked. Belle's mom. Her eyebrows shot up. I thought she was like, gone, or whatever. Apparently, Jacob said with a roll of his eyes, her parents had given Belle away without her knowledge. But, she carried the baby. She was in a coma. Oh. And the guy with her? Her fiancé, Jackson said, with a little too much disdain in his voice. Rachel and Jacob eyed him. What? He snapped. Nothing. Are you going to open her gifts? Jacob asked. Jackson shrugged, maybe later. He and Belle stayed at his dad's house until around 8 when Belle was tired. He packed the trunk with all of their gifts then went home. Tonight he got off, so once he put her to bed, he had free time to himself. And he found he didn't like having free time. It made him think about Catherine. And he didn't want to think about her. He sat on the couch and opened one of the gifts she'd gotten him. It was a white Gucci t-shirt. He rolled his eyes, while thankful for her gift. When would he ever wear this? Not at work. At work, the dress code was black shirts. It could be collared or just a plain t-shirt, like he liked to wear, but it had to be black. That way you'd fade more into the background and not stand out like a sore thumb. He sat the shirt back into the box and pulled out his phone and texted her. Jackson, thanks for the gifts. Jackson, Belle really loved the stuff you got her, especially the nail polish. Catherine, I'm glad and you're welcome. Did you like your stuff? Jackson, I did, thank you. I should have gotten you something. Catherine, letting me be a part of Belle's life is the greatest gift you could give me. Jackson, I see. Catherine, is she in bed? Jackson, yes. Catherine, you. Jackson, no, just sitting on the couch. Catherine, sounds nice and quiet. Jackson, it is. Catherine, well, I'm going to head to bed now. Today's festivities were energy draining. Jackson, good night. Catherine. Catherine, good night. Jackson. Jackson refused to read too much into the heart she'd sent. She was engaged. He tossed his phone onto the couch, then headed to bed. Catherine waited for Jackson to respond, but he never did. She chided herself for putting that heart. Why had she put it? It wasn't like she had feelings for him or anything. And even if she did, it was too late, she was engaged to someone else. A few days later, New Year's Eve. Catherine was excited for the new year. At first, she planned to spend New Year's Eve with her parents like she did every year, but she found herself asking Jackson what he had planned. He said he and Belle were just going to stay at home. She then found herself asking if she could come over and spend it with them. At first he seemed hesitant, and she feared she overstepped her bounds, but he agreed. So here she was, again struggling to decide what she was going to wear. She decided to go with some comfortable clothes since she may be staying up until midnight. She got to his house at 7, around the time she'd normally be leaving. Jackson informed her that Belle slept through most of the day to prepare for this. They spend their time watching movies or playing games. To her surprise, Belle managed to stay awake until 11, when she succumbed to the desire to sleep. Jackson put her to bed, then he and Catherine watched some of the New York celebration on TV. Finally, the time for the ball to drop came. A 10-second countdown began. Jackson called his dad for the countdown. Catherine called her mother, who was beside her dad. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year, Catherine said. She looked at Jackson and he looked at her. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him. He hesitated only for a moment before kissing her back. He pulled her onto his lap as their tongues dueled inside one another's mouths. It was a hot, demanding kiss that left her breathless and wanting more. Jackson's eyes were dilated. They both were thinking the same thing. He told his dad Happy New Year, then hung up. She did the same for her parents. As soon as she was off the phone, they headed to his bedroom. He locked the door and they tore off each other's clothes. Their mouths met again and they fell into bed like this was an everyday occurrence. She remembered what he'd liked last time, and from what she could tell, he remembered what she liked as well. It was like they were made for one another. They made love until about 2 in the morning. He collapsed beside her as they got their breathing under control. Her phone rang. She sighed and went into the living room to get it. She had 10 missed calls from Alexander. The gravity of what she'd just done came crashing down on her. She'd just cheated on her fiancé. She answered, "Hello. Catherine. God, are you okay? I've been calling you. I'm sorry. I didn't hear my phone ringing. It's all right. You should like you're having fun. I'm at my cousin's. We had a bachelor bash." She chuckled humorlessly. "What'd you do to celebrate?" he asked. I spent it with Belle and Jackson." She gulped. "Yeah. See, whatever it is that's bothering you, just say it." Jackson and she couldn't bring herself to tell him that she'd willingly fallen into bed with him, and enjoyed every minute of it. "You slept with him," he guessed. She gulped. He didn't sound angry. She nodded until she realized he couldn't see her, then she said, "Yes, I see. Are you mad?" He sighed, "Not necessarily, no. You were honest with me and this is a business marriage, so it's not like I'm in love with you or anything. But if you want him so bad, why are you marrying me? It just happened. One thing led to another. Do you even want to marry me?" "Yes. It'll be good for both of our families. It's the least I could do for my parents." "Okay then. Don't let this incident repeat itself. Imagine what would happen if someone found out you cheated on me. How would that make you look? How would that make me look?" She gulped. "Right. It was a one-time thing. Good. Talk to you later, Catherine." "Yeah, bye." She hung up and turned around. Jackson was standing there in all his naked glory. She glanced at him and he had an unreadable face on. "That should have never happened," she said with as much conviction as she could muster. He stayed silent for a moment, then nodded, "True. I'll just get my stuff and get going." He nodded again but stayed silent. She gathered her stuff and left as quickly as she could. She could only hope that this little slip-up didn't affect her relationship with Belle. Jackson was pissed. He was pissed at himself for falling into bed with her. He should have known better. She was engaged. But the sex was so amazing. God, she was the best lay he ever had. But then he overheard part of her conversation with her fiancé. Of course, how could he forget she was engaged, and from what he could tell, happy to marry him. Only now did he realize he might have been wondering what a life with her would look like. Would she stay home with Belle or want to pursue a career? He clenched his fists. He'd never know, because she was marrying another man. He went back to his room. It smelled like their joining. He opened the window and tore all the sheets off. Then he threw on some clothes and went into the living room. The couch would have to suffice. He couldn't sleep in the bed where he just fucked her. Where he just fucked another man's fiancée. Ugh. That's how low he'd just gone. He was disgusted with himself. If her fiancé came after him, he'd deserve it. How would he feel if his fiancé slept with another man? Let's just say she wouldn't be his fiancé any longer. He grumbled, got somewhat comfortable, and went to sleep. On the way home, Catherine made up her mind. She wanted to be in Belle's life, but the ever-present temptation of Belle's father wasn't going to go away, unless she sued for part custody. To do that, she had to talk to her parents to get access to the family lawyer. It was going to be a hard conversation to have, one she'd been avoiding, but after tonight's incident, she had to do it. The sooner, the better. The next day. "What's going on, Catherine?" her mother asked as she and her father were seated. Catherine took a deep breath, then let it out, decided to get straight to the point. "No point in dragging this out. I know about Belle." Her parents visibly paled. What do you mean you know about Belle?" her father asked. "I know you guys gave her to her father when she was born, without my permission." "Dear, don't you dare dear me. You gave my child away without my say-so, and didn't tell me afterwards. What kind of parents are you? We did what was best for you." "What was best? What was best? Are you kidding? Do you know how much I wanted children? And to think, I've had one of my own all this time and didn't even know. What would people think of you if you were a single mother?" "Fuck what people think. This is my child, my life, we're talking about. Anyway, I met her last month." "You met her? How? When? Where? It doesn't really matter now, does it? I've decided to sue her father for part custody." "What? But we gave him full custody already." "You did, not me. You can either help me or I will get my own lawyer." Her parents looked at her for a moment, probably trying to tell how serious she was, then looked at each other. Finally, her father nodded with a sigh, "We'll help you. At least you're engaged so it won't look so bad." Her mother nodded. Catherine resisted the urge to spit some smart comment about how they cared more about their image than her life and the life of their granddaughter. A week later, Jackson sat a plate with a grilled cheese sandwich and some chips and tangerine slices in front of Belle for lunch. It made him think about Catherine. He'd made grilled cheese for lunch once and she'd loved it. Ever since New Year's Eve, she hadn't been around. Belle kept asking for her but he said she was busy. In all honesty, he didn't know what happened. Had their little mistake sent her packing and out of Belle's life? She hadn't called, texted, or anything. He'd forever hate himself if his lack of control ruined Belle's life. There was a knock at the door. He went and opened it. There stood Catherine. But it wasn't the Catherine he knew. She seemed distant. She had on a pantsuit and her hair was pulled back into a slick ponytail. Belle, however, didn't see anything but the regular Catherine. "Catherine," she said, running over and hugging her leg. Catherine seemed to relax a little and hugged her. "Hi Belle. Where have you been?" Belle wailed. Catherine gave her a soft smile. "Don't worry sweetie, hopefully, I'll be seeing a lot more of you in the future." Jackson stiffened. Why did that sound like it was meant for him? What did she have up her sleeve? Then two men stepped into view behind her, and his heart lurched. One was her fiancé, Alexander. And the other was a man Jackson hoped he'd never see again, the Belford family lawyer. It took all he had not to drag his daughter back and slam the door in their faces. It was clear why they were here. They wanted Belle back. Like hell was he giving her back. As far as he was concerned, Catherine was a surrogate mother to Belle. She hadn't been around for any of her firsts, so what if that wasn't her own fault? She had her nerve waltzing back here to try to take his pride and joy away from him. He pulled Belle off of Catherine's leg. "Go finish your lunch." "Okay. Then Catherine, you can paint your nails with me." Like hell, Jackson thought, but he didn't say it. Once Belle was gone, he glared at Catherine. She winced. Jackson, no, he didn't know exactly what he was saying no to. Was it her use of his name, because every time she used it, he wanted to let her do whatever she wanted? Was it to giving them his daughter back? Yes. "Mr. Forrester, can we come in and talk?" Alexander asked. He hated that he was being so professional, because if he said no, it just looked so petty. He stepped aside and let them in. They sat in the living room, out of earshot to Belle humming as she ate her food, blissfully unaware that she might not be living here very soon. He knew the power that the Belfords had. He wasn't about to deceive himself into thinking that he could stop them. He stood facing them with his arms crossed, because it made him feel like he had some control over the situation. "I want to get partial custody of Belle," Catherine said. He knew that's why they were here, but to hear her say it just set him on edge. He just stared at her instead of responding. He knew that if he opened his mouth, he would do either of two things. He'd either curse them out and tell them what he thought of their snooty, rich asses, or, he'd beg them not to take her away from him and make himself look like a fool. So he kept his mouth shut. "We have a court date set already and everything. All you have to do is show up," she added, like that was a good thing. He glared at her, to make it very clear that he was this close to blowing a gasket. "We don't want to take her from you completely, and during the time she'd be with Catherine and I, you'll be able to see her," Alexander said. And that made Jackson hate him even more. He was trying to be nice. If he was so nice, he wouldn't be here in the first place. And the way he said Catherine and I just got under his skin. He clenched his jaw. "Here is all the information, Mr. Forrester. We hope you'll cooperate so that we don't have to do this the hard way," the lawyer said, sitting some papers on his coffee table. He glanced at the papers, then back at Catherine. She almost looked remorseful. He almost scoffed at that. Then Belle came running in with her greasy fingers and jumped into Catherine's lap. "I'm all done now. We can paint our nails." Then she looked at Alexander. "Do you want to paint your nails too? Daddy doesn't like his painted, so it's fine if you don't either." Alexander looked momentarily speechless, but then he smiled. "I'll paint mine, if it's fine with your dad that we stay a little." Everyone looked at Jackson. He felt like he'd be the villain if he said no when all he wanted to do was throw them out on their asses, tell them where they can shove their custody crap, and slam the door. But Belle was giving him those pleading eyes she knew he couldn't resist. "Fine," he ground out, spun on his heels, and walked out. Catherine felt her heart ache. She'd hurt him. Underneath that angry exterior, she could see the pain she'd inflicted. She barely knew Belle a couple of weeks, and here she was, taking her from him already. But it had to be done. Belle brought out her nail polish basket, which now included the ones she'd gotten her for Christmas. She chose a pink for herself, a blue for her, then looked at Alexander. "What color?" "Black," he asked. She shook her head. "I don't have black." Catherine pointed to a sparkly gray. "What about that one?" He playfully glared at her. Belle found a dark blue and gave it to him. They painted their toes for the next hour. Belle seemed to take to Alexander quite quickly, and he seemed to genuinely like her. Catherine found herself looking for Jackson every now and then. He was nowhere to be seen. She felt tears prick the back of her eyes. Maybe this had been a stupid idea. But it was too late to turn back now. She sucked the tears back and went on painting her toes, laughing at Alexander's jokes, and helping Belle like she was perfectly fine, when inside, she had a sinking feeling that she'd made a terrible mistake. 2 weeks later. Jackson hated courthouses. He hated suits as well. But here he was, in the courthouse in a suit, about to fight a legal battle over his daughter. His family had not taken well to the news. They cursed the Belford one way or another. Especially Jacob. He'd been furious. And rightfully so. He went into the room and sat down beside his lawyer. His family was by no means poor, so they could afford a good lawyer. Maybe, just maybe, the judge would only give Catherine 3 months or something. He wasn't sure how he'd be able to handle 6 months. "How are you feeling?" his lawyer, Danielle, asked. He replied, "As okay as I can be in this situation." She nodded. "I understand. Just let me do the talking and we'll be fine." "Okay." Catherine and her lawyer came in a few minutes later. He couldn't even look at her. It wasn't so long ago that he'd been wondering what a life would look like with her as his wife, but oh how the future had other things in store. Now they were fighting a legal battle. The judge arrived only moments after them and he took his seat. Each side presented their arguments. Catherine didn't really have any proof that her parents sent her child away without her permission, but she did have proof that she'd been in a coma at the time. Danielle, on the other hand, pointed out that Jackson had been raising Belle her whole life and Belle was doing just fine. She also showed how the Belfords had already signed over full custody. Lastly, she pointed out that Catherine had only been in Belle's life for a week now, and that it was too early to throw her fully into that without her father so soon. Jackson felt satisfied that she'd made a good argument, and that whatever would come from it was out of his control. The judge sent them out on a break for 30 minutes while he deliberated over the evidence. Jackson paced the entire time. The suspense was killing him. He had to know the fate of his daughter right away. When the time was over, he practically ran back into the courtroom. The judge sighed. "Okay, so here is how this is going to do. For the next 6 months, Mr. Forrester is to take Miss Forrester to see Miss Belford at least once a week. You two will have to work out what day that will be based on your schedules. After that 6-month time period, Miss Belford is to get 25% custody of Miss Forrester. That means 3 months out of the year. That will be July, August, and September, the summer. That is all. That could have been worse. Jackson stood up and walked out, followed by Danielle. Not bad, she said. He nodded, thank you for everything. You're welcome. Could you work out a day for Catherine to see Belle? I'm free any day, so it's up to her. She nodded, will do. Thanks. No problem. He collected the paperwork, then headed home. Jacob had come over to watch Belle. Well, he said as soon as he walked in. 6 months of monitored visiting, then the summers. Jacob nodded, could have been worse. Jackson nodded, could have. Catherine felt a twinge of disappointment at the verdict, 3 months a year. That was it? She knew for a fact that Jackson wasn't going to let her visit during the 9 months he had her, not after this. She met up with Alexander to lunch after the court case. Well, he asked as they sat down. I have to start with 6 months of monitored visiting so she can adapt to me, then I get the summers. He nodded, you don't seem happy about that. I don't know, would have been a lot easier if you just told him you have feelings for him and not agreed to marry me. Her head snapped up, what? Come on, Catherine, any person with eyes can tell you two have it bad for each other. But Catherine. If you would stop for a minute and think about what you really wanted, none of this would have happened. Her jaw dropped. Her fiancé was telling her she should be with another man. When did you become a therapist? He shrugged, here's the thing, Catherine, I think we should call this engagement off. What? Why? We've been engaged for a month. I know, but you should be with him, not me. She couldn't help but feel like he wasn't telling her everything. What aren't you telling me? He flinched. Spill Alexander Jensen. There's this woman, oh. Shush. Anyway, we were seeing each other before you and I happened. Then why didn't you object? Well, see, my parents would never approve of her, so, I don't know. I guess I thought this was a good escape. A good escape for the both of them, Catherine admitted to herself. Before the engagement, she'd daydream about what it would be like to be with Jackson. She did like him and he was an excellent father. But in the back of her mind, she knew her parents wouldn't approve of him. They'd said so not too long ago. Is that why she'd readily agreed to marrying Alexander? Was she, like him, trying to find an excuse to run from her growing feelings because of her parents? And her lack of belief in everlasting love? God, she was pathetic. It was crystal clear, she was. She looked up at Alexander, promise me you'll go after this woman if I go after Jackson. He grinned, deal. So engagement off. Engagement off. They shook hands, then dug into their lunch. Leaving the restaurant, Catherine felt invigorated. Now, all she had to do was find a way to go after Jackson. Maybe Quinn and Tara would have some ideas. She called up her besties and told them they needed to have a meeting tonight. They readily agreed. Tara promised to bring wine. That evening, Jacob nudged Jackson, look. Who the fuck wears suit to a club, he said. Jackson looked up and saw Alexander coming towards the bar. He gritted his teeth, that's Catherine's fiancé. Jacob's eyes widened, what's he doing here? Beats me. You serve him. If I do, I might slip something in his drink. Jacob snickered, who says I wouldn't? Because you're responsible and he didn't do anything to you directly. Jacob rolled his eyes as Alexander came and sat on a stool. He walked over, hello. I'm guessing your brother told you all the juicy details about me. Jacob deadpanned, yeah. Why are you here? I need to talk to you. Me? Yes, you. You're Jacob Forrester, right? Jackson's brother. Well, yes, but why do you want to talk to me? I need your help. Now Jacob was really confused. You need my help? Yes. How well do you know your brother? Very well, I'd say. So you know he has feelings for Catherine, right? Jacob glanced at Jackson, then back to Alexander. Yeah, Catherine feels the same way. She was just too blockheaded to realize it before she agreed to marry me. Jacob arched an eyebrow. You can't tell Jackson any of this. Okay, Catherine and I called off the engagement. You did? Why? Because we're in love with each other, Alexander deadpanned. Huh? I'm confused. Alexander rolled his eyes, because she's in love with your brother and I'm in love with someone else. Oh. Anyway, I have a cabin up north that's a great vacation spot. I need you to get Jackson there and I'll get Catherine there. You want me to help you set them up? Do I need to spell it out? Jacob grinned. I'll do it. Alexander slid him a card. Here's my cell. Text me so I'll have your number. I'll send you the details when you do that. Jacob took the card and nodded. Okay. Whiskey. Huh. I want a whiskey. Oh, yeah, sure, 1 second. Jacob went and got a whiskey for Alexander. No sooner had he finished than Jackson pulled him aside. What bullshit was he feeding you? He and Catherine are setting up the nursery at his place. He was talking about the stuff they were going to buy. Belle. Jackson looked downright deadly at that. Oh yeah, his brother had it bad. A week later. Where are we going? Catherine asked Alexander. She still wasn't sure what to do about Jackson. Maybe some time to let him cool off would be best. And then Alexander insisted on taking her up north on a spontaneous trip. A little time off would probably be a good idea, especially since her parents were on her case now, saying she and Alexander needed to start planning their wedding for the spring. Up north. I have this cabin that's a nice place to get away, he said. She nodded and leaned back in her seat. Getting away was just what she needed. Where the hell are you taking me? Jackson asked. Dad and I thought it was best for you to get away, recuperate, and then come back. Don't worry, we'll take good care of Belle. And whose idea was this? Mine. You've been wound tight like a spring since all of that went down. Jackson sighed. His brother was right. He had been wound tight, expecting the Belfords to want more of his daughter. Some time off was just what he needed. He settled back into his seat and enjoyed the ride. It was a 2-day drive, but they made it to the cabin. It was in the middle of nowhere with no signal and nobody for miles. Wow. Catherine said, stepping out of the car. I came up here a few days ago and stocked this place with enough food for 2 to last a week, Alexander said. She nodded. You and I are going to have fun. She briefly thought about Jackson and what it would be like to spend a week with him in isolation. She shot the idea down as soon as it was formed. He was probably still mad at her. Alexander carried her stuff in. Thinking back, that was the first sign that something was off. He didn't bring anything inside the cabin. Alexander finally got a text from Jacob about 15 minutes after he and Catherine arrived. Jacob, we'll be there in 10 minutes. Are you there yet? Alexander, yes. Jacob, okay, good. Don't let me see you outside. Alexander, got it? Jackson's eyes widened when a cabin came into view. It was cozy looking. There was a car parked out front. Someone else is here. It's the owner of the cabin, Jacob said. Jackson nodded. Good, because I have no clue how to get a fireplace going. Jacob laughed. They got out. Grab your stuff, he told Jackson. Jackson got his suitcase and they went inside. Your room is over there, Jacob said, pointing to a door down the hall. Jackson nodded and went to drop off his stuff. When he returned, Jacob was gone. There was a note on the door. He looked at it. You'll thank me later. What the heck, he said. Jackson. He still then slowly turned around. Catherine? What are you doing here? What are you doing here? They stared at each other for a couple of seconds before the light clicked on. They went to the window and looked out. The cars were gone. Jackson groaned. Jacob, the little shit, set him up. Catherine didn't know whether to kiss Jackson or Alexander next time she saw him. He'd set her and Jackson up. And they couldn't go anywhere. Jackson turned to look at her. Looks like we're stuck until they come back. I should have known. She tried to hide her smile but failed. He eyed her suspiciously. Did you know about this? Me? No. I was just as clueless. Uh-huh. And what would your fiancé think about this? Alexander dropped me off. His eyebrows shot up. And we're not engaged anymore. His eyes widened. She decided to get it over with now. Taking a deep breath, she looked him in the eye. We were both in love with different people. Jackson gulped. There was no mistaking the underlying meaning behind her words. But what about the custody thing? He asked. I'm sorry. I just had to find a way to not be around you because if I was, I knew what happened on New Year's Eve would happen again. It wasn't if, it was when. I was trying to run away from the feelings you evoked in me. That's why I agreed to marry Alexander. If I was married, I couldn't have you. What's so bad about me? Well, my parents had a special type of man that I needed to be with. And now? She laughed humorlessly, they still do. But I want to be happy for me. I want to be with someone who wants me for me and who I want for them. He searched her eyes for any hint of her lying, because by God did he want that too. And he wanted it with her. She gulped nervously and looked down. I understand if that's not what you want. He lifted her chin and leaned down. I want that too, sweetheart. He kissed her. It was a slow, sweet kiss filled with thoughts of the future and forgiveness. I love you, Jackson. I love you too, Catherine. A week later. We're back. Jacob said, busting in. Alexander was close on his heels. Jackson rolled over, taking Catherine with him. She moaned in protest. Well, I think our plan worked, Alexander said. Jackson cracked an eye open. What are you two doing here? To check up on you and Catherine to make sure you didn't starve each other to death, outright beat each other to death, or fuck each other to death, Jacob said, wiggling his eyebrows. Go away, Catherine muttered, snuggling closer to Jackson. We'll just drop off some food then. We were prepared to leave you two here for as long as it took to get you to reconcile, Jacob said. We were fine on the first day, you dipshit, Jackson said. Well, you both tend to be hard-headed, so you never know. Catherine uttered a very unladylike curse, then sat up, bringing the sheet with her. It's 7 in the morning, she hissed. Alexander nodded. It is. Are you two ready to head back to civilization or do you want to stay here? She yawned. We better head back. Jackson needs to buy me a ring. Jacob and Alexander looked at each other, then smirked. 20 minutes later, all four of them were leaving the cabin. Jackson linked his and Catherine fingers together and smiled at her. She grinned and snuggled a little closer. 2 months later. Quick, put it in here before Daddy gets back, Catherine told Belle. Belle slipped the lid onto the box and Catherine hid it behind her back just as Jackson walked inside the house. Over the last 2 months, she and Jackson had solidified their relationship. Her parents still didn't know. They didn't seem to notice that she was wearing a different ring, either. She and Jackson planned on telling them tonight over dinner. But first, she and Belle had a little surprise for him. He looked at them quizzically. What's going on? He asked with a raised eyebrow. She smiled and gave the box to Belle. Belle handed it to him. He looked at Catherine. What did she have up her sleeve now? He opened the box and his breath caught as he stared at the pregnancy test. He looked up at her. "You're pregnant." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. He scooped her up and spun her around and kissed her. "God, I love you." She laughed. He set her down and gave her a real kiss, then picked up Belle. "You're going to be a big sister." She beamed, "And we can paint our nails together." He and Catherine laughed. Catherine looked at the clock. "We need to get ready to go. We're supposed to meet my parents in 45 minutes. Jackson nodded. He got Belle dressed because Catherine always took longer. Then he got ready and Catherine did Belle's hair. They were out of the door in 30 minutes. The drive to the restaurant took 15 minutes. They'd be arriving fashionably late. He unbuckled Belle and they went inside. Her parents, Samuel and Patricia Belford, were already seated. They looked at each other when he, Belle, and Catherine approached. "What's going on?" Patricia asked Catherine. "Does he not like the custody arrangement?" Catherine chuckled. "This isn't about custody, Mom." "Then what's going on?" "You'll find out soon." "Where's Alexander?" Catherine sighed. "I don't know." "Now please, let us do the talking." Her mother humphed but didn't say more. Jackson sat Belle down and everyone ordered. He could see Patricia becoming more and more agitated. Finally, Catherine spoke. "Mom, Dad, I'm sure you both know Jackson Forrester." "Yes. He's Belle's father," Samuel said. Catherine nodded. "And my fiancé." Patricia sputtered. "Never. Alexander and I terminated our relationship months ago. I've decided that Jackson and I are going to get married and we have another baby on the way. You can either support us because you love me, or you can keep acting like rich snobs and I'll be out of your life, with your grandchildren." Jackson was taken aback by her sharp tone, but it seemed to be just what her parents needed to hear. Her dad nodded for a moment before he extended his hand to him. "Welcome to the family." Jackson shook his hand. "Thank you, sir." Patricia, on the other hand, didn't say anything further. Surprisingly, the meal wasn't strained. Jackson actually had a conversation with Samuel. After the dinner, Patricia took Catherine aside. "Dear Mom, if you're about to try and talk me out of this, it won't work. I love Jackson and I'm going to marry him." Her mother searched her eyes for a minute then sighed. "I can't stop you, can I?" Catherine shook her head. "It would mean the world to me if you'd support me." Patricia nodded. "I'll try." Catherine hugged her mom. "Thank you, Mom." "Do you like to paint your nails?" Belle asked her grandmother. Patricia smiled. "I do, darling." "Would you like to come over tomorrow and paint our nails together?" Belle smiled widely. "Yes, please." "Such a well-mannered child," her mother said to Catherine. Catherine motioned to Jackson. "All his doing." Patricia studied Jackson, who was in a conversation with Samuel about the best whiskies. She smiled softly. "He'll make a fine husband. He cares for you." Catherine nodded, feeling tears threaten to come out. "He does. He really does." Her mother gave her a hug. "I'm happy for you, Catherine." "I'm happy for me too." Once they parted ways with her parents, they headed to Jackson's. By the time they reached the house, Belle was asleep. Catherine carried her in and put her to bed. Then she joined Jackson in the room they'd been sharing. "Tonight went well," she said. He nodded. "I expected more fight from them." Catherine laughed. "To be honest, so did I. Maybe Alexander told them something already." Jackson shrugged. "Maybe. I'm just glad they're on board with our marriage." She kissed him, trailing her fingers down his chest. "Me too, Catherine, me too." Jackson and Catherine went on to get married a few weeks later. Jacob was his best man and Quinn was her maid of honor. Tara couldn't because she was pregnant again and not feeling so well. They bought a house together. Jackson ended up being a stay-at-home dad while Catherine continued to work at her father's business. Jackson mostly ran the business aspect of the club since his dad wanted to retire soon. He and Catherine had a baby boy which they named Jason Forrester. Bell was always trying to paint his toes, so Catherine had to find some gentle nail polish for her to use, finally. As for Samuel and Patricia, they became doting grandparents. Belle and Patricia even started having salon days where they'd spend all day painting their nails and eating dainties. Catherine was just a little jealous. And as for Alexander, he did end up going after the girl. As it turns out, she was his father's assistant. They did end up getting married about 6 months after Jackson and Catherine did. And they all lived happily ever after.